that the history of the history of the regime's brutality and its shift to neoliberal economic development since '86 has indeed polarized society and its polity beyond repair, and increasingly created profound discontent among most social sectors in Syria. Combined with the cynical as well as the clumsy external support of both the civil and armed opposition, Syrian uprising was militarized and radicalized, and with ample support from its organic and strategic allies, the regime also was kept afloat by, in general. By 2014, the Syrian uprising gave way to a fully developed proxy war, in which any notion of revolutionary victory was now divorced from the original sentiment of the peaceful protesters. The form, content, and relations of rebel groups became a main source of controversy and discursive wars about the nature of the uprising. And this continues to be until today a major point of contention. The point of contention has never been whether the regime is authoritarian. The point of contention has never been that most people in Syria, or the overwhelming majority, would rather see change. The contention is and has been about the nature or the transformative nature of the opposition in both its civil and military garbs. A crucial conduit for this controversy was the array of external forces that intervened and helped shape the course of the Syrian uprising on all sides. This talk, I hope, will address the rise and transformation, ostensible fall, and contrary to popular belief, the future prospects of an Syrian uprising or of a Syrian uprising. Um, if it is possible to mute things on your end because it's feeding back into my speakers.
Okay, we'll try.
Thank you. Emboldened by the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings, Syrians mobilized to demand justice. First, by protesting against economic corruption, symbolized by the person of the president's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, and later by calling for the downfall of the regime. Contrary to popular belief, the uprising in Syria did not start out with demanding the departure of the president or the removal of the entire ruling class or the overthrow of the regime. It started with more modest demands to end corruption, symbolized by the president's cousin. The quick switch was precipitated by the brutal suppression of the mostly peaceful protests early on in Dir'a in southern Syria. The combination of continued regime brutality and the eventual external intervention on behalf of the opposition um, by various countries, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States, quickly led to the militarization of the revolt. No sooner than the opposition's allies poured their money and weapons into the uprising, and no sooner than the flow of foreign fighters took on a systematic form, mostly facilitated by Turkey early on through the passage that it opened into Syria, did the regime's own allies mobilize to support and protect the regime economically, militarily, and diplomatically or politically. Neither intervention, both on the regime side or the opposition side, prioritized the interest of the Syrian people. And this is the key point. This is the tragic point. Instead, they prioritized protecting or changing the regime to serve their own local, regional, and or international interests, again on all sides. Sorry?
We hear you very well, Bassam. Continue, please.
Okay, because I can hear feedback. 1 second. 1 second. Okay. Um, the
The
introduction,
introduction.
sorry, support also came from individuals, militias, and non state actors who poured in from near and far to assume their position in this conflict. So it wasn't just states on the side of the opposition and on the side of the regime, it was also individuals, various forms of militias or groups, and non state actors who came in from various places as far as Malaysia and the United States and North Europe and as near as Jordan and Tunisia. This arms personnel and political race on three fronts, on all sides, midwifed the uprising's transformation from a legitimate protest against a neoliberal dictatorship to a local, regional, and international attempt to redraw the political map of the region where Syria has always constituted a pivotal case. The introduction of totalitarian and hardline Islamist elements in quotation marks because these days, everything is considered Islamist and terrorists and so on. So we have to put quotation marks on all of this without absolving anybody from responsibility, of course. But the introduction of totalitarian and hardline Islamist elements to the Syrian quagmire, either on behalf of an embattled opposition open to any form of external support, or, as with ISIS, on behalf of its own regional designs related to the dismantlement of Iraq, further complicated the struggle. Specifically, this introduction of, if you will, the Islamist element provided the regime with an opportunity to fulfill its manufactured prophecy regarding the terrorists opposing it. Suddenly, the regime, as it has done years before, as have other countries in the rest of the world, adopted the discourse on terrorism that the United States espoused. This recasting of legitimate resistance into terrorism was common practice, of course, among all superpowers and their allies, as well as countries in the developing world, whether it's US, Russia, Israel, or whether, of course, it is other countries throughout the world, as they face their own resistance. And I'm referring here to the early part where the Syrian uprising included, for the most part, if not overwhelmingly or wholly, people just going to the streets. Invariably, the outcome is a reversal of roles between perpetrators and victims. In this case, the Syrian regime ultimately benefited from the transformation of the uprising, from the inclusion of hardline Islamist elements, from the militarization, and from the very awful act that many parts of the opposition conducted in order to do their bidding. It benefited from these developments, and the more so as these hardline opponents gradually alienated Syrians with their own exclusionary discourses and practices. Parts of the opposition began adopting the regime's own tactics. Other parts went beyond the regime's tactics, such as certain groups with their actions that were considered abominable by Syrians, just like the regime's actions were considered abominable throughout the years. By 2014, the Syrian uprising gave way to a fully developed proxy war in which any notion of revolutionary victory again became um, divorced from the original sentiments. The idea here is that the form, content, and relations of rebel groups is the main source of controversy. And this is the kind of issue that, as I suggested, continues to be the case. And I will be addressing those issues as well as the role of the outsiders in this transformation. Because if we would like to see or to uh, think about the future in Syria, there is no future in Syria without recognizing the role of the already involved regional and international players. I will come, therefore, to the question of I call them the outsiders. In my book that I'm writing on Syria today, or this year, for the past few years, is titled Understanding the Syrian Tragedy, Regime, Opposition, Outsiders. Three categories. I'll talk about the outsiders. If a central source of controversy over the Syrian uprising relates to the status of the opposition and rebel fighting groups, a crucial conduit for this controversy is the array of external forces that intervened and helped shape the course of the Syrian uprising on all sides. I will say a few words on the role that all external non Syrian parties played in the conflict directly prior to the uprisings and through its first 6 years. Within less than a year from the emergence of mass protests in Syria, regional and international forces had mobilized to back their local allies in the Syrian conflict. The opposition, in broad terms, drew immediate support from Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, as well as from a steady stream of foreign fighters conventionally called jihadists from neighboring countries as well as distant places, as I suggested, such as Afghanistan, Norway, and the United Kingdom. After a brief period of hesitation, the United States threw in its weight, and when I say brief period, I'm talking about a few weeks to a couple of months. The United States threw in its weight, going beyond its initial call to remove Bashar al-Assad from power, whereby initially they were trying to figure out if there is a way to deal with the status quo, just as they did with their other with other Arab countries, which were actually their allies, whereby only at the 11th hour, in the case of Egypt, for instance, did the United States or the State Department issue statements that they stand with the people. Of course, that itself happened after the United States was able to guarantee, based on its dealings and connections with the SCAF, the Egyptian military authority, that they would guarantee the Egyptians, that is, the maintenance of various treaties that they have in the region, specifically with Israel. The point is that U.S. officials and agencies proceeded to provide various kinds of logistical and material support to the rebels at levels that continue to be rather unclear, though recently, as we've heard, there was an announcement that these would be cut off. But were surely extensive in all cases, all along, even if these efforts fell short of providing the most sophisticated weapons. The idea here in Beirut, I'm in Beirut now, or across the world on cyberspace, is that the US didn't do enough, didn't do much, or didn't do anything. That's not true. It also is not true that the US went all out. Both narratives are incorrect. For the most part, the US was quite heavily involved directly, and that is something that we know from the official stories, but also, and more importantly, indirectly, by actually being the guarantor of much of what has happened within the Syrian context early on, as a function of some of its allies' support and sort of position on the Syrian regime. A position that actually changed also last minute, given that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, well, less so Saudi Arabia, but definitely Qatar, definitely Turkey, had actually been in steady connection with the regime, and in the case of um, Turkey, has been or had been trying to figure out various economic schemes regionally with the regime, so that they could work on mutually beneficial economic ventures. And of course, everything changed after March, April, May 2011. On the regime side, the Syrian regime had more than its share of external support, starting with Iran, Hezbollah, various Shi'i militias from Iraq and Afghanistan, and ending with China and Russia on the international diplomatic front early on, and of course after 2015, with boots on the ground and planes in the sky. Boots on the ground, weapons, and financial support were provided generally for the Syrian regime, or to the Syrian regime, so it can remain afloat, as various calculations were underway, including ones that were based on battleground developments. Even the closest allies needed to know that the regime was worth the support and investment, including Iran. This is another uh, conventional uh, assumption that's not correct, and that is that everything was what it is today. In other words, the Iranian support, the Russian support actually went through various periods early on in the first few months where there was a need, first of all, to communicate to the regime that it needs to steady its hand and kind of reduce the violence it's been using, especially from Iran. These were actually public, communications at points. Only after the regime demonstrated that it is capable of standing up did we find an increase in the support and a more involved. And there are many backdoor issues that we do not know, but we could tell from the nervousness or from the uneasy feeling of the Iranian regime early on that it was concerned that this might actually flip out of control and get the regime in trouble. And therefore, if that's the case, Iran would lose its strongest ally in the region at a precarious time, nonetheless. In all cases, perhaps the most critical support of perhaps the most critical sort of support early on was diplomatic. The Russian and Chinese veto at the United Nations ensured that there would not be a legal international cover for taking action against the regime. Not that this has stopped the United States in the past in the case of Iraq. As I already addressed, what ensued is nothing short of the transformation of the Syrian uprising from a concerted local mass protest against a dictatorship to a fully or full-fledged regional and international proxy war. Exogenous factors like the emergence of ISIS played a disruptive role, mostly for the Syrian opposition actually, and constituted a divergence that was welcomed and encouraged by the Syrian regime. It is not true that the Syrian regime created ISIS or were allies with ISIS. I mean, myths about the Syrian war or the Syrian uprising abound on all sides. This is one of the ones that abound on the question of the Syrian regime's relation to ISIS. The proxy war was complete and legitimized. Not only was the objective of external intervention either to protect or depose the regime, it was now a semi-concerted effort to accomplish one of these objectives, but under the cover of fighting terrorism, a charge that was supported by the regime and its allies and the opposition and its allies. Everybody wanted to fight terrorism. I guess it must be fun. This charge that was supported by the regime and its allies and the opposition and its allies, this multi-layering of purposes diluted the uprising. The fact that you had all these conflicting directions and conflicting uh, 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 goals, even if terrorism was some part, this multi-layering diluted the uprising, bolstered the war on terrorism, and left the regime standing, even if barely so. And that is sort of where we're at some level. Ultimately, the clear loser, even if there are no clear winners, because there are no clear winners in Syria, was the Syrian opposition, but both in its civilian and military garbs inside and outside Syria. And clearly, the biggest loser out of all of this are the Syrian people themselves, who, after 2011, early on, became invisible. No one cared about the Syrian people. No one from all sides actually prioritized the Syrian people. Even the local coordinating committees that were actually active and were celebrated were then drowned out by the sound of the barrel and the gun. It is a tragedy of sorts that everyone also used opportunistically for their own purposes. The regime did that, opposition did that, international actors did that, and the regional actors did that. And the most hypocritical of all, of course, is the role of regional actors who not only egged on the uprising and militarized it beyond, in my view, beyond repair, were the least giving in reference to the millions of people who left Syria, the refugees, were actually not hospitable to almost any of them. These are the empirics. more profound questions remain unanswered, questions that I will attempt to shed light on and engage with to the extent possible in my own book, as I shared. What were those real drivers of external intervention? What was the nature and extent of the intervention? Because this is a standing question. Whose allies had a bottomless limit to their support? In other words, who saw the regime's or the opposition's demise in existential terms and who saw them in political strategic terms? This, of course, is a huge indication of why the regime's supporters were willing to go all the way and the opposition supporters kind of gave up after it became complicated. Or as we say in Egyptian or perhaps Lebanese, falsao. They just disappeared in a way. And now they're fighting with each other, as you probably know from the past few months, where Qatar and Saudi Arabia are exchanging accusations of who actually radicalized the Syrians and the Syrian uprising and so on. Accordingly, what is another question is what is the weight and influence of these allies in steering the conflict? Finally, how much of all of the above could have been reasonably anticipated or approximated early on? And in light of this, what were the miscalculations and fundamental mistakes committed by some of these actors? In particular, I would like to address the relations between the regime and its main allies, as well as the relations between the opposition and its main allies, in a manner that illuminates overlapping and differing short and long term interests. The pivotal intervention of Russia, for instance, reveals almost identical short term interests with the Syrian regime. However, in the medium run, it is evident that the preferences of the two governments are likely to diverge. We began to see this during the Astana talks sponsored by Russia. The Syrian regime is ultimately interested in restoring its rule over the entirety of Syrian territories, if possible, or at least what it calls useful Syria, Surya al Mufida. And the Russians are more interested in serving their national interests. On the one hand, the Russians are interested in establishing influence and control in a stable Syria, regardless of who exactly is at the helm, so long as they are compliant. And on the other hand, they are interested in using such a successful intervention to serve as a precedent for asserting their newfound regional and international role amid economic trouble at home and in their own neighborhood. Such distinctions allow us to cultivate better judgment in evaluating alliances and agreement durability, especially when such analysis is applied to all players. In other words, those distinctions actually allow us to make better judgments on a lot of the controversial topics at hand. On the other hand, it is important to hone in on the nature of the support for the opposition and its twofold shortcomings. First, the most counterproductive objective pursued by the supporters of the uprising is that they focused primarily on defeating Assad, not on building a robust, inclusive, transparent, and democratic opposition. A related mistake is that what is called Friends of the Syrian Revolution befriended and supported nearly any party that was willing to help overthrow the regime. This was based on the miscalculation that Assad's fall would be quick, just as the fall of his counterparts in Egypt and Tunisia, reducing thereby the risk of creating another monster in the process outsiders were supporting to overthrow Assad. But given the geopolitics of alliances, the regime was never likely to crumble, at least not in the short term, the way other regimes did. And there are reasons that I'm happy to discuss, having to do with the nature of the cohesiveness of the Syrian regime as opposed to the cohesiveness or lack thereof elsewhere, as well as the autonomy that certain institutions within these other regimes had, or relative autonomy, such as the army, which was almost completely absent in Syria. In all cases, given this the geopolitics of alliances, um, the regime was not likely to fall that quickly. And thus, the feared monsters, as they are called, and their existence was put to good use by the regime and later by President Trump, whose increasing alignment with Russia could be concealed by prioritizing anti terrorism. So the supporters of the uprising overplayed their hand, assuming there'll be an imminent fall before whoever they supported becomes or turns into a Frankenstein of sorts. That didn't happen. The regime didn't fall, and the opposition turned into a Frankenstein of sorts, at least the military opposition. A Frankenstein in the sense that those who did not want that outcome were faced by that outcome, which they then actually had to uh, deal with. In other words, the Saudi Arabian government, after 2013-14 and around, began to sort of hit pause on much of support. So did the Qataris, so did the Turks. The Turks were also motivated by the bombs that started going off in their own cities and airports, and so on and so forth. The United States had a whiff of Al Qaeda and began to also curtail at least its discourse, not necessarily its on the ground support early on, and so on. In effect, and without robbing local rebels and opposition parties of agency, the unfolding outcome saw the creation of various radical rebel fighting forces that were at odds with the original goals of the uprising. That is, the feared monsters or Frankenstein. The concomitant outcome, besides this idea of having these rebel forces turn into what was feared, was the delegitimization of the official opposition and the rebel forces in the eyes of enough Syrians so as to tilt the momentum as well as the moral high ground gradually away from the opposition. This was a very important moment of distress for the opposition and supporters of the Syrian uprising that was. I say the Syrian uprising that was because so many people in Syria and outside Syria supported a Syrian revolution, supported a Syrian uprising, but not that one. And it's not because they were waiting for the perfect uprising, they just rejected a totally corrupt and problematic uprising. Because there's always this refrain that you can't wait for the perfect uprising. I agree with that. But you also don't take the worst sort of the outcomes are actually, or the writings on the wall and the outcomes are actually not likely to um, unfold the way most Syrians want. Contrary to what regime supporters might claim, also, this shift away from the 2013 and 14 did not create a swing vote in favor of the regime itself. Simply, it led to a withdrawal of active, not passive, support for the Syrian opposition and rebels because some people, many people, continued to support the opposition and passively, but were not willing to act in any way, shape, or form. And what this usually is an advantage on part of the status quo, which is the regime. If most people are not acting to change something, that something is going to be maintained. It is at that critical moment that various groups on both sides of the building their own militias, fighting and defense forces, on militias, fighting and defense forces, and groups to fend for themselves in the absence of an existing desirable contender to support. Even in the regime controlled areas, people wanted to fend for themselves, not be part of the regime's strategy of crushing the opposition necessarily, even if they accepted some of these plans. And therefore, they created their own militias, worked under the umbrella of the regime, but not under the command of the regime because their military objectives were different. That is actually something that reveals the extent to which things are complex even inside the regime territories, starting from 2012 And it is that phenomenon that today is actually going to cause, or has been causing, some problems and might cause many more problems for the regime today in September or October 2017, because these militias ultimately paid a heavy price to maintain the status quo or to avert a takeover by the other side that was viewed as uh, more of an evil of sorts. These militias today want some sort of payback, want some sort of compensation, and the regime doesn't have the resources, doesn't, and certainly doesn't have the power to bring them into its fold in that manner. So this is an open issue to for us to observe. This analysis generally benefits immensely from the developments in the aftermath of the Aleppo battle, which helped uncover much of the misconception about both sides. These developments reveal the problematic nature of the rebel fighting groups that spearheaded the opposition. They also uncover the meager weight the Assad regime had in the run up to the Aleppo battle. It wasn't the regime necessarily, whether it's the Aleppo battle or other battles, that actually was able to shift the battlefield advantage to their side. It was its allies that made it possible, even if regime forces participated uh, in the execution. Predictably, this is symptomatic of its role, the regime's role, since the Russian intervention, particularly after March 2016, when the Russians sent a clear signal to Assad that they would be leading the charge against the rebels, billed for international purposes as the fight against jihadists or terrorism and all that stuff. This highlights one last dimension, which is the international community. What a wonderful word. One of the side effects of analyzing external intervention in the Syrian case is a better understanding of the value of what is called the international community, particularly in an international state system that is gradually moving away from unipolarity. Beyond examining the myth of the international community, because at some level it's either a misnomer or a myth, the manner in which international actors acted or not in relation to the uprising, the proxy war, the human rights violations, and the massive displacement that produced millions of refugees speaks of a much more interconnected and multipolar world that is headed inexorably to a phase of dangerous hypernationalism, which we are viewing everywhere around us, from the United States to Europe to Turkey and elsewhere. Without delving too deeply into such forays, the takeaway for the Syrian uprising is that the goal of political, economic, and social emancipation is going to be made that much more challenging in the coming years, regardless of who remains standing. Now, I have lots more to share, but what I would love to do is stop here and perhaps engage in a conversation that teases out some of the issues that you think would be worth addressing. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bassam. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you see us or no?
I see you, I hear you, everything is beautiful.
Great. So I'm glad that you did not give up. Thanks for your patient time and a great talk. I would like to start with two questions. The first question, in the last 2 days, I was reading some of your works, and especially your focus on the changing nature of Syrian authoritarianism, especially the role of business networks. And I'm trying also to connect it with our last seminar 2 weeks ago, in which the speaker highlighted the fact that Syria moved from a rent-based authoritarianism into neoliberal authoritarianism. And in the two cases, the authoritarian nature of the regime remained. What changes is the type of social and economic alliances the regime has been building. And the continuity of the authoritarian nature for me is related to the fact that the regime continued in either cases, whether in the 70s or the neoliberal phase post 2000 or end of the 90s, continued to monopolize violence in Syria. So, with that in mind, my question is, how do you perceive the change in the nature of Syrian authoritarianism today, as the regime is actually outsourcing many of its security functions? You touched upon the difficult relation that is taking place now between the regime and the militia groups. But what does that tell us about the nature of the Syrian authoritarianism today? And my second question is about the geopolitical element that you highlight of organic. Do you hear me?
If you can repeat the second question, you cut off for like 3 or 4 seconds.
You focus on the geopolitical dimension of the Syrian crisis, and you highlighted the role of the outsiders to the extent that you were saying that you cannot ignore this role in any future scenario for Syria. And my question here is that what does this tell us about the nature of the Syrian state? Like, why the Syrian uprising has been internationalized to that extent compared, for example, to the Egyptian revolution? What does that tell us something about the nature of the Syrian state? And I'm asking this question and with mind some of the arguments about the artificiality of the state. Yeah, and here I will stop. Shall we continue the questions or?
Maybe one by one.
I mean, this
you to answer one by one.
I think I usually like to take them all together, like 3 or 4. But I think there's so much here that I'd rather like get it out of the way, because it's also like an overarching question. So I'm happy to do it as quickly as I can, if that's okay.
Okay.
First, I am not sure about this transformation from. I'm not sure what it means. This transformation from land-based to neoliberal economy. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a neoliberal economy in the developing world, because it exists everywhere, and rent-based economies are not that they overlap significantly. The extent of the overlap is the discussion, but to speak of 2 different models, I would love to see that research, because it seems like we're splitting hairs. However, the business networks in terms of their existence then and now, I mean, that's a very important topic, because these networks kind of began to dissipate in 2012, not before. And we have a war economy that has restructured the way the Syrian economy works, not just in the non-regime controlled areas, but also in the regime controlled areas. So today we can no longer speak of a national economy. We can actually speak of a hybrid mixed economies in different parts of Syria that are structured mostly by the logic of what is called the war economy, its new warlords and its new economic elite that have emerged, not just again outside the regime controlled areas, but also inside regime controlled areas. And that's basically an entire discussion that has been absent from Syria news and analysis, because everyone was much more interested in the political intrigues and so on, whereas in reality, the factor that basically was able to bind Syrians, whether they're fighting or not fighting with each other, or non-Syrians and Syrians, whether they're fighting or not fighting, is the war economy, which actually created stable relations at border areas, whether between the Syrian regime and the rebels, or between the rebels and ISIS, or between the Syrian regime and ISIS, which is sometimes taken as an alliance. It's not. It's just a mutually beneficial arrangement that any two groups at any economic point or border had to actually contend with or trade off. If you controlled the electricity on one side, someone else controlled the roads or oil on the other side or other resources, there was a barter. As far as the geopolitical dimension of the Syrian uprising, what does it tell us about the nature of the Syrian state and so on? Um the nature of the Syrian state is, in my view, less of an issue here, although the nature of the Syrian state tells us why the regime didn't fall as quickly. It tells us, it answers what happened to the regime inside Syria at the time of the uprising. But what tells us more about its regional position is much more its political positions and its alliances. Uh, so the reason why Syria drew this much attention is the extent to which its position and its politics and its alliances were contested. And if you want to enumerate, you could start first of all with the fact that the Syrian regime became, after 2003, after the fall of the Iraqi regime, and 2007, 6, 7, when Gaddafi suddenly became a model for President George Bush Jr. simply because he gave up his chemistry set, or what is called his WMD program, and paid off the Lockerbie victims. Syria became the only, last and only major hurdle vis-a-vis various forms of alliances in the region that bring together the United States and its conservative Arab allies. So that is one starting point that is not in and of itself the main issue. The main issue is the alliances of this starting point of Syria, which are mainly, of course, Hezbollah on the one hand and Iran on the other. And there's, of course, a kind of a symbiosis there at all levels. And that is and continues to be the most threatening alliance for states like Israel locally, and for any forms of or designs for domination, hegemony, control, for states like the United States. It also is a source of concern at some level for some of the Arab Gulf states, given their connections not only to the United States, but also to Israel, as we have known for years and years, but as we have seen explicitly in the past couple of years. So those kinds of this kind of positionality and alliance with in terms of Syria's situation is what drew intervention at all fronts. There are many other issues where Syria constituted a pivotal role in the region, or is part of a is at the intersection of various conflicts, such as the Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, as I suggested, but also the two camps that are kind of at odds for quite some time now: Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and their allies. Even if Qatar has always played very interesting roles in going back and forth, it was a supporter in 2006, for instance, in the war, the Hezbollah war with Israel, and so on. So there's that. There's also the Sunni Shi'i, uh, I don't know what to call it, conflict, which is produced as in the West, at least, as an endemic conflict. It is not. It's a political conflict that has taken sectarian terms for reasons that can be addressed, even if those sectarian terms became or began to develop a life of their own, just like they were mostly a function of policy and politics. They actually devolve back to a situation where this is not an endemic conflict, but Syria is viewed as uh, as such, and mobilization of the uprising and the opposition did proceed at that level. The regime's response also used sectarianism. Everyone did, so that they preserve their interests. So it's Syria's alliances and position, much more so than Syria's states, that explains the interventions, much more so than the state which explains what happened after the intervention. Of course, also Syria's alliances with Russia constitutes for Russia the closest ally in the region. Syria constitutes the closest ally in the region, and its gateway to various forms of politics in the region. So that also explains the investment of Russia, at least at first. Russia has, as I suggested, other reasons as well. So I'll stop here. But there's a lot more that can be said.
Thank you.
By the way, ask a question. Bassam, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
My name is Harut. I'm the other postdoctoral fellow on the project. Just a follow-up question on the business networks. In your book, you applied business networks in Syria. You applied network analysis to reveal the structure of the business networks that have sort of dissipated since 2011. You do this without fully disclosing names and connections, and you actually explain why that was such a difficult task as a researcher in terms of methodology. I'm wondering about the prospects of applying network analysis nowadays. First of all, to reveal the networks that existed before 2011, and second, to use network analysis to reveal the war economies that you speak about. There's a great deal of difficulty and challenge to actually name and pinpoint these war economies that we keep speaking about, but maybe by studying their structures, there's a lot of stuff that could be said about what kind of future Syria is heading towards.
Okay, thank you. I can take a couple more if possible.
Thank you very much, Bassam. This was really very stimulating. I particularly highlighted to myself for future reference a number of terms like the multi-layering of purposes, which I think is extremely suggestive, and the way in which the Syrian people became invisible. Now, my question has to do with those invisible people. You did indicate that in various areas which have been dominated by a variety of actors, Nusra and other militias in the territories that we know of. You know that you have stated that much of the population had been alienated by the practices, by the laws that were being brought in, and so forth. Now, my question is this. Given, let us say, a period of 5 years of control, including alternative systems of justice, including alternative systems of education, including alternative ways of behaving in public, particularly for women. What about the long-term effects on a kind of alternative acculturation of local populations in these areas, which are under militia control, most particularly taking into account not only that there are locals, of course many locals who flee, but that many of these areas are composite with people coming in from different parts of the country, if you were to take Idlib as a case in point, which would then make a kind of social engineering quite an urgent task on the part of whoever holds political and military power, and indeed economic power.
Okay, thank you. No, this is a very difficult question, but I try to address as much as possible what might be ways to think about this given you mean in non-regime areas mostly?
Yes, I mean in non-regime areas, yes.
Okay, yeah. No, this is actually it's not it's very important, but it's in many cases, depending on how things develop, it's not a growing concern, because those groups that we're addressing that are in control of non-regime areas are actually not having a good time. In other words, they're actually losing, like ISIS, and losing territory, losing followership and support, and others like Tahrir, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is al-Nusra, which is the umbrella for now for the opposition, actually the rebel opposition, and has kind of weeded out Ahrar al-Sham in a way, which is its only serious competitor internally, is actually also more besieged than flourishing, even though there are, and I think it's a card that powerful players are playing, but it's something that it's turn of, if you compare today with 2015, is actually much less given the power, prestige, territorial control of these groups. But it is still an important issue to discuss. So I'll should I take another question, or do you want me to answer?
Is there another question?
I think it's very good how you do the multi-layer presentation, but it strikes me, the intervention of the Northern Europe and colonial formation of Syria. It seems that here play an important role, how the international community reacted. So we know that Syria, it's a result of League of Nations, and now the United Nations somehow did the same mistake. But my question exactly here is how the northern state, part of NATO, and important players, they entered there a couple of weeks, if I understood well, a couple of months after the revolution, what they did there, and why at a certain point they disappeared. And now we don't speak anymore what some European countries did there and how they contributed to mess up. Sorry for my non-academic word. So, did you have any thought on this? How they put there some seeds and they disappear and they left for the big politicians like Putin, America, and veto of United Nations.
You mean the northern European states, or you're talking about Western states, including the United States?
You said at a certain point that historiography after the revolution, when it was so aside of the big players, Russia, America, and Arab states, so it was some European states. Who are they and what they did? Grasping.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, the networks that I discussed in the book, you know, involve individuals that I also put in the book, but they're not actually identified as themselves, or identified as people that I interviewed. So in many ways, the story is not very obscure. People know who these people are. People who know Syria. Unfortunately, people who do not know Syria well internally, won't have names. But inside Syria, I mean, there are like 15 or 16 major names that are known, and their networks are actually quite well known. Either to the extent that you know what's happening inside Syria, but the more important point is the structure of these networks and the reason why state business relations take on the form of informal networks at certain point in time. Now, I'll skip that discussion because that's a very long discussion, and I'll get to the uprisings where these networks maintained their unity early on for many purposes, including the fact that people, especially capital doesn't take chances. So people weren't willing to switch sides early on because it wasn't sure whether the regime was going to hold up or not. When the time came where the regime's situation grew more precarious, the networks began to disintegrate slowly depending on various factors. First factor was, and that's the most important factor, which explained the behavior of the largest number of people within these networks, is the extent to which their assets are intertwined with the regime. If your assets are intertwined with the regime in an organic way, you were less likely to defect, even if you internally were among the harshest critics of the regime. So that explained a lot of the reasons why a lot of people didn't leave, although some did, even within this category, which means that we need to also recognize that sometimes these views can trump capital, but that's a minority of the cases. Another criterion had to do with the extent to which uh, these players had capital and investments outside Syria or opportunities outside Syria. To the extent that they did, a lot of people actually left Syria, went to Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Northern Africa, Europe, and the United States to actually continue their work, their business, engage in capital flight, and didn't have to worry about whether to present themselves as pro-regime, pro-opposition, or neutral because they left. Another criterion had to do with your location. That's the third criterion, whereby if you are located within regime-controlled areas and you were against the regime and you did not have the opportunity to leave the regime areas, you basically had two choices: either to be neutral in public, in other words, you don't support the regime, but you also don't oppose it, and the regime understood that position and was very complacent with people of this sort, so long as they did not act against the regime or speak against the regime. The other variety is to be neutral, but on the side, in an underground manner, support the opposition through various forms of funding, whereas this form of funding or support is actually clandestine. People don't know about it, and it's not clear if you're doing that or not. The third option, of course, is to leave regime areas and announce in a full-fledged manner that you're opposed to the regime and present your support for the opposition in an explicit manner. Now, all of this refers to criteria in terms of what people were likely to do who were part of the networks. Um, there are other issues, including the fact that early on people were likely to play along. Only later, when the regime began to basically exhibit some signs of vulnerabilities, right before, if you will, Hezbollah came in full force, and right before external support came in even more full force, there was a period where the regime's odds were actually not good, and it's that period where you began to see the defection. So timing is an overarching factor, but the criteria for behavior actually referred to the three I suggested. Of course, the last criterion is the question of the state bourgeoisie, the people who are part of the regime and are themselves some of the biggest benefactors of the neoliberal economic status quo in Syria prior to the uprising. These people, for the most part, overwhelmingly stayed with the regime because of the criterion that I addressed, which is their assets are intertwined with the regime. Even if they send their families abroad, and even if they send some of their capital abroad to actually have a plan B, which many did, but they did not abandon the regime. In that sense, those became the constituent parts of the new networks that were no longer alone. They were joined by war economy uh, lords, if you will, that developed immense wealth as a function of their role in the war economy. So these became the new entrants to the regime controlled areas They were the new entrants into the networks. And then on the other side, it's a whole different game. We're no longer talking about economic networks connected to the regime. Those other formations had to do almost strictly with the war economy, because if you're not in the regime controlled area, you're actually not doing well, because the regime actually bombed everything through the barrel bombs. It stopped, as one of my colleagues said, they didn't intend to kill people as much as they intended to kill life altogether, whereby people would either go back to regime controlled areas or just leave. So the networks that were created in the regime non-controlled areas were actually a function of the development of the war economy and the new warlords that were connected for the most part to the rebel groups, but also to various people who were able to rise up in that environment, and as a function of their connections with the Turks, the Jordanians, or otherwise, or even the regime, by the way, were able to serve as the new masters of these economic relations. And those kinds of networks, frankly, if anyone tells you a lot about them, they're taking you for a ride, because we don't know very much about them. I cannot speak about them beyond a certain point because we don't have the empirical data and we don't have the field observation. I hope this helped start to answer some of your questions, because it's actually not easy to answer fully. Um, as far as Dr. Al-Azmi's question, which, by the way, I should stop and say that when I was growing up in the 1990s, early 1990s, uh, it was a dream for me to actually, meet Dr. Aziz, and I am so humbled and honored that he is sitting there listening to me pontificate about some topic. I'm very excited about this, and I'm sorry that I couldn't come and meet you, but I am really intent on doing that, and I hope we can talk about this further at some point. Um, so, sorry.
You're most flattering. Thank you so much.
Oh, la, seriously. Me and my friend Sinan Antoun have a lot of memories about reading your work and wanting to connect with you. Um, now, your question is difficult in the sense that yes, there will be a serious social issue, and it's everything you pointed, plus the question of education. If you consider the education that many have gotten in Syria outside the regime-controlled areas, and it's not like the regime-controlled areas' education was stellar even before the uprising, as many of you know. But outside regime-controlled areas, you have a serious deterioration in education, in questions of gender relations, and that's not also a way of saying that everything is fine inside regime controlled areas. But you do have these social challenges in terms of education, gender, family life, personal freedoms, and many more less or more subtle issues that actually depend on who was controlling which area. So, for instance, when before ISIS took over Raqqa, Al-Nusra was in control. Al-Nusra did not actually change the educational system. They used the regime's books, if you will, not the regime's books, but the official books of the Syrian educational system. For the most part, they added more religious instruction and so on. That's it. When ISIS took over, they eliminated the entire curriculum of the state, and they replaced it with a religious curriculum. And in those areas, people who have been living under this rule for like years, 3-4 years, know nothing but that, grow up learning nothing but that for the most part, or learning other skills that mostly have to do with fighting skills. So that's an interesting way of looking. One second, let me. So that's an interesting way of looking at some of these developments. In terms of other issues, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that during wartime, we saw things in Syria that actually might have given us the wrong impression, in the sense that, yes, during wartime, you will see more conservatism. You will see people turning to religion. You will see people using certain forms of religion as their shield and their weapon. But right after war settles or begins to settle, a lot of people leave leave their ranks and go back home. And depending on the sort of social services and developmental factors, things might actually come back to normal to a relative extent. So it all remains to be seen, given that the non-regime controlled areas are actually either shrinking or are becoming less ruly or more unruly because of the question of resources, the question of people figuring out that this is not what we actually fought for. I didn't fight for, uh, you know, an uprising that now actually presents the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as the leading factor in it. So this disillusionment is actually causing a recalibration intellectually and mentally, but of course, in terms of the actual movement, it remains to be seen what happens with the reconstruction plans, which I was invited, for instance, to various conferences in which this was addressed. We are ourselves at the Arab Studies Institute working with various Syrian research institutions to provide alternative paradigms for development and reconstruction in Syria. It's a very thorny issue. It's a thorny issue because the regime considers itself to have won, and it has its own ideas about development, and its allies have their own ideas. Uh, you have Gulf money waiting to be spent in Syria for reconstruction and development of areas inside and outside the regime. You have Chinese capital waiting on the sidelines and have already started, in some cases, being invested. You have the international financial institutions also preparing their own programs, which might, to an extent, reproduce the drivers of discontent if they are not if they are not formulated properly. And you have, major stakeholders like Russia and Iran who would like to have the largest share of the pie because they sacrifice the most for the Syrian regime. So it all depends on all these factors, and what's going to end up happening to the opposition, and whether outside Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the rest of the opposition will come back to the regime's fold in some odd way, which might resemble the situation in Palestine, where Israel used the PA after Oslo to do its dirty work in the occupied territories. The regime might actually ally itself with the non-jihadist component of the opposition in their own non-regime controlled areas to do the dirty work, or the work that the regime is actually not capable of doing in those areas as a function of these agreements. Now that the funding has actually become more and more scarce, a lot of people who are not self-funded, in other words, a lot of non-jihadist organizations outside Hayat Tahrir Sham, are probably going to look for ways to keep going, and the regime will be there to provide some of these ways, but maybe others as well. I know this is not satisfactory, Dr. Azmi, but it's a moving target.
Thank you very much.
And then and thank you, no, thank you. And then how the northern nations. I didn't understand whether you're referring to the northern or in general how they came in and left. My impression of the countries that supported the uprising is that they supported the uprising for their own purposes, not for the sake of building a robust uprising that can actually take down a tyrannical regime. And the evidence is they actually themselves supported the regime right before the uprising, all of them, or were complacent vis-a-vis the regime. So it's not that they always oppose the regime. And even Saudi Arabia Syria relations the past 10 years before the uprising, I mean, it wasn't extremely warm, but there were many cultural relations that allowed actually for the growing conservatism that we saw in Syria in the 10 years prior to the uprising, which is mostly funded and supported by various forms of Saudi support. And we can, this is a different issue altogether. So these states were not organically connected with the Syrian opposition. They just were making a strategic move. The nature of their relationship to the Syrian uprising was not existential. It was barely strategic. And when the odds were against them, they basically gave up or retreated in one form or another, or to one extent or another. Whereas the others, especially Iran and Hezbollah, they viewed the Syrian conflict in existential terms that related directly to their odds in a Middle East absent this particular Syrian regime, or a Syrian regime that was fully in sync with them. And that provided them with the incentive to go all the way. No other supporter of the opposition was willing to go all the way. They all left. The US, the Arab conservative Gulf states, and Turkey. So and that explained sort of the desertion, if you will. Russia was willing to face the challenge and succeeded compared to the others, not because it has the most stellar strategies, but because the rest were miserably failed. So now, as far as Europeans, I know I'm calling into a country in Europe, but the truth is that nobody really cared what the Europeans thought in Syria. In a sense, they didn't think this was the crux of the issue. It's always the United States and funding from neighboring countries. Uh, Interestingly, however, Europe received most of the refugees, notwithstanding complications, as opposed to the United States or the Gulf countries. And of course, Turkey is in the lead here. Not sure how you want to consider Turkey in relation to Europe, but yeah, the Europeans weren't, basically played along with the United States much more than anything else at the discursive level. I hope this was somewhat satisfactory. I'm not sure if I addressed all the dimensions of these questions.
Generally, sorry, Sam, the Europeans generally tend to put the bill. You know this from Palestine, where the Americans create messes and the Europeans pay, right, for reconstruction.
Yes.
A number of other things. The same happens in the part of the world you're talking about, right? Yes,
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
ultimately, funders, and purveyors of goodwill.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have more time for more questions. So thank you again for your time and for a very enlightening talk. And please join me.
Thank you. I will be.
Send me your phone number.
Absolutely. And if there is a way I could get a copy of the recording, I would really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll be on
Shukran. Everybody, have fun. Enjoy Budapest. I'm very sorry I couldn't make it.
Thank you.